Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled through the trees, dragging thick waves of snow across the frozen ground. Jake pulled his parka tighter around his body, watching as his breath billowed out in ghostly clouds. "This storm's coming in fast," Mark muttered, securing the last stake of their tent. "You sure we should stay out here?" "We'll be fine," Jake said, slapping Mark's shoulder. "We've camped in worse." Mark didn't look convinced, but he said nothing. But the two of them had planned this trip for weeks, hoping to escape the city and test their survival skills. But as the wind picked up and the temperature plummeted, an uneasy feeling settled over Jake. By the time night fell, the blizzard had fully descended upon them. The fire flickered weakly against the relentless gusts, casting jagged shadows on the walls of their tent. "I don't like this," Mark admitted, sipping from his flask. "I swear I heard something before we set up camp, something moving in the trees." "Probably an animal," Mark shook his head. "It sounded human," Jake laughed. "Out here, in this storm?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, he pulled his sleeping bag up to his chin and turned onto his side, clearly not in the mood to argue. The storm only worsened as the night deepened. Jake lay awake, listening to the wind moaning through the trees. Every so often, he thought he heard something else, a faint crunching noise like footsteps in the snow. At first, he told himself it was just the wind. But then it came again. Closer, deliberate. His breath hitched. Something scraped against the side of the tent. Jake shot up, heart hammering. "Mark?" Mark was already awake, eyes wide with terror. "You heard it too?" he whispered. The scraping sound circled them, slow, purposeful. Jake reached for the knife he always kept in his pack. "It's probably just an animal." Then a voice came from outside, a low, whispering voice. "Help me." Jake froze. The voice sounded thin, weak, but there was something off about it, something that sent a cold shiver through his spine. "Please, help." Mark grabbed Jake's arm. "We should go. Now." Jake swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, but if someone really was out there... "Hello?" he called, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, suddenly, the tent sagged inward as if something had pressed its weight against the fabric. Mark screamed. Jake scrambled backward. Then, just as quickly, the weight lifted. The only sound was the storm outside. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Jake reached for the zipper, determined to look outside. Mark grabbed his wrist. "Don't." But Jake had to see. Slowly, he unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the white void. Snow swirled in thick sheets, making it almost impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. There was nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Just an endless, frozen wasteland. Jake exhaled sharply and zipped the tent shut. "There's nothing there." Mark didn't respond. He was still clutching his sleeping bag, face pale. They tried to sleep after that, but rest never came. The storm raged on, and though the voice did not return, they both felt it, something watching them. By morning, the blizzard had died down. The forest was eerily silent, the trees heavy with ice. Jake stepped outside first, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. "See?" he said. "Nothing out." He stopped. A few feet from the tent, half buried in the snow, was a set of footprints. They led in a slow, meandering path toward their camp. But there were no footprints leaving. Mark stepped up beside him, staring at the tracks with wide eyes. "No way." Jake's breath caught in his throat. The footprints hadn't been there last night, and whoever or whatever had made them had never left. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill straight to his bones. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the trees, the voice came again. "Help. Me." Jake and Mark didn't waste another second. They grabbed their gear and ran. They didn't stop until they reached their truck miles away, their lungs burning from the cold. As they drove away, neither of them spoke. Neither of them looked back. But Jake knew, whatever had been out there in the storm, it had been watching them the whole time. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow began falling heavier by the time Daniel and Eric finished setting up their tent. They had hiked deep into the wilderness, far from any roads or other people, seeking a challenge. The forecast had called for snow, but nothing too serious. Now, as the wind howled through the trees, Daniel wasn't so sure. "Think it'll get worse?" Eric asked, stomping his boots to shake off the cold. Daniel exhaled, watching his breath swirl into the frigid air. "We'll be fine. We've handled worse." They had camped in winter conditions before, but something about tonight felt different. The wind didn't just howl, it almost seemed to whisper. The thick pines around them groaned under the weight of the accumulating snow, their skeletal branches creaking like something alive. As darkness settled, the storm intensified. Their small fire struggled against the wind, casting flickering shadows across the snow. "Tell me that doesn't look like a person," Eric muttered, pointing to a shadow cast by a gnarled tree. It stretched across the snow in a way that vaguely resembled a figure, long and misshapen. Daniel chuckled. "Relax, it's just a tree." But even as he said it, a strange feeling crept over him. The night was too quiet between gusts of wind, as if the forest itself was waiting for something. A sudden sound snapped them both to attention, a crunching noise, unmistakably footsteps in the snow. Eric grabbed his flashlight and swung it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the swirling snowflakes, illuminating only trees and empty white ground. No tracks. Nothing. "You heard that, right?" Eric asked. Daniel nodded slowly. His first thought was that it had to be an animal, but the steps had been too steady, too deliberate. They both listened, hearts pounding, but the only sound was the wind. "Probably just the trees settling," Daniel finally said, more to reassure himself than Eric. Still, they decided to turn in early, zipping themselves into their sleeping bags, the storm raging outside their tent. At some point in the night, Daniel awoke suddenly, unsure why. The wind had died down to a low moan, and the silence was deafening. Then, just outside the tent, he heard it. Crunch. A single footstep. His pulse slammed in his ears as he held his breath. Crunch. Another. Closer this time. He turned his head slowly and saw Eric, wide awake, eyes locked onto him. He had heard it too. Then came the whisper. Low. Hollow. Just outside the thin nylon of their tent. "Help me." Daniel's blood ran cold. The voice was barely audible, but undeniably human. Eric sat up, his breath quick and shallow. He mouthed the words, "What the hell?" The voice came again, more desperate. "Please, help me." It was right outside. Daniel's mind raced. Could someone really be out there in this storm? Lost? Freezing to death? He hesitated, then reached for the tent zipper. Eric grabbed his wrist. "Don't," he whispered. Daniel hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to look, to help. But Eric's grip was like iron. "Listen," Eric breathed. No footsteps leading up. Daniel's stomach twisted. He turned his head slowly and saw it was true. There was no sign of anyone approaching their tent. No prints in the fresh snow. But something was out there. Then came the sound of something dragging against the tent fabric. Long, slow, like fingers tracing along the surface. Daniel's heart pounded. Then, silence. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Finally, Eric whispered, "Is it gone?" Daniel strained his ears. The wind had picked up again, but beneath it, nothing. Hours passed before exhaustion finally overtook them. When they awoke, the sun had risen, casting a grayish light through the fabric of the tent. Daniel hesitated before unzipping the flap. The world outside was blanketed in fresh snow. The storm had passed, and yet, just outside their tent, there was something in the snow. Not footprints. Not normal ones. A single, deep trench, as if something had been dragging itself away from their tent into the forest. Daniel and Eric stood frozen, following the eerie trail with their eyes. It stretched for at least 30 feet before vanishing into the tree line. No human could have moved like that. Neither of them spoke as they packed up their gear in record time. They didn't look at each other as they hiked back to the car, constantly checking over their shoulders. As they drove away, Eric finally broke the silence. "You heard it, right?" "The voice?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah." Eric swallowed hard, staring out at the endless stretch of white trees. "Then tell me why there weren't any footprints leading to our tent." Neither of them ever went winter camping again. So,
Story number 3.
the snow had started falling by the time Brian and Alex reached their campsite deep in the mountains. The sky was a dull gray and the air had that thick, heavy stillness that signaled an approaching storm. But they had checked the forecast before leaving. Light snowfall, nothing serious. "Think we should turn back?" Alex asked, glancing at the thickening clouds. Brian shook his head. "Nah, we've come too far. We set up, stay one night, and head back early in the morning." Alex didn't argue, but there was hesitation in his eyes. They had done plenty of winter camping before, but something about today felt different. By the time they got the tent pitched and a fire going, the snow was coming down heavier, blanketing the forest in eerie silence. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, but beneath it something else stirred. A sound, faint, a distant rhythmic crunching in the snow. Alex straightened. "Did you hear that?" Brian listened. The sound was gone, just the wind. "Probably just ice breaking," Brian said, trying to sound confident. Alex didn't look convinced, but he let it go. They ate a quick dinner by the fire, then crawled into the tent to escape the cold. The wind worsened. Brian lay awake, listening as the gusts rattled their tent. Every now and then he swore he heard something else, something out of place. A slow, dragging sound, not the wind, not the trees shifting. It was close, just outside their tent. He turned to Alex, but Alex was already awake, staring at the tent wall, his breath quick. He had heard it too. Then came the whisper, low, hoarse. "Help me." Brian's blood turned to ice. It was a voice, a human voice. Alex sat up so fast that the tent rustled. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Brian could barely breathe. He reached for the zipper of the tent, but Alex grabbed his wrist. "Don't," he whispered. "Something's wrong." Brian hesitated, but every instinct told him to look. If someone was out there, lost in the storm, they couldn't just ignore them. Slowly, he unzipped the tent. The wind blasted in, stinging his face with ice. He swept his flashlight across the campsite. Snow swirled in the beam of light, but beyond that, nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just an empty, white void. Alex's breathing was shaky. "We should go," he said. Brian swallowed hard. "Where? We can't hike out in this." The wind screamed louder, shaking the tent. Then from deep in the trees, the voice came again. "Help me," longer this time, drawn out, too close. Brian and Alex sat frozen, their breath the only sound inside the tent. Then something pressed against the fabric. A shape, not a hand, not human. Long, thin fingers pushed inward against the tent wall, pressing so hard the fabric stretched. Alex stifled a cry, scrambling backward. Brian couldn't move. He could see the shape clearly now, long limbs pressed unnaturally against the tent, as if studying them. Then, just as suddenly, the weight lifted. The wind continued to howl, but the presence was gone. Neither of them slept that night. When the first light of dawn crept over the trees, they unzipped the tent and stepped into the freezing air. Snow had piled high around them, untouched, except for one thing, a long, deep trail leading away from their tent. Not footprints. A single, dragging mark, disappearing into the forest. Alex turned to Brian, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave." They packed in silence, constantly looking over their shoulders. Neither of them spoke until they reached the car. Only then, as Brian turned the key in the ignition, Alex finally said it. There were no footprints leading to the tent. Brian gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't respond, because he had already realized it. Story the end.